Hello, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. Welcome back. We're going to continue our remote Sunday school lessons that we started at Jerome United Methodist Church, and I'm putting this out to allow people of the congregation and anybody else to look at our study of the New Testament. We're having an interesting situation as we go through Paul's letters. Let's go back through a little bit of the history. Paul's letters are often quite different from each other, different from what many people think. Certain of them are basically theological. Galatians is the clearest representation of salvation by faith and faith alone, that you don't earn salvation with your works. Romans is very much a theological statement. Also, while Paul had started the churches in the Galatia area, which is an area, not a city, he had not been to Rome yet when he wrote the letter to the Romans. It was an introduction in which he very nicely lays out salvation through faith alone and various other issues, and he says he's looking forward to visiting them. This is a very different letter. As we said last week, it appears that this is the second of the three letters Paul sent to the Corinthians. The first letter is mentioned in the earlier chapters in this, and it appears to have been lost. Nobody really knows exactly what was in it, but it was done in response to problems in the church. And what Paul's trying to do here is to maintain a long-distance relationship with the congregation that he started essentially on his own. And if you remember, Corinth was a wealthy, prosperous, sophisticated Greek city on the east coast of Greece, right where the isthmus comes in, separating the northern part from the southern part, the Peloponnese of the southern part. And it was a major trading site, and of course, therefore, it was wealthy and prosperous. And Paul's congregation there included a number of wealthy people, including Erastus, who was the city treasurer. That's a very prominent person to have in your congregation. And he's trying to maintain a long-distance relationship, which is very difficult. And he was in Ephesus at the time. This was like 52 or 53 AD. And he receives a delegation from Corinth because of problems in the congregation. And they've got a variety of problems, which we have discussed some of them before. And we now have a different group that we're going to discuss here. And as I said, this 1 Corinthians is probably the most complicated of Paul's letters because he touches on multiple different things. He actually ends up discussing spiritual gifts and the great love sonnet that people use at their weddings and other situations like that. And to make another point that we have to keep in perspective, that Paul really did not expect us to be reading these letters 2,000 years later. He didn't think the world was going to last 2,000 years. He thought Jesus was going to come back in his own lifetime. And so therefore he's got a much shorter term look on what it means to be a Christian. They expected the parousia, the return of Jesus, in a few years. And that obviously hasn't happened. It's been almost 2,000 years now. So that's a very important thing when you consider some of his advices. You know, if you're not married, you don't want to get married, don't bother, and things like that, because, you know, the world's going to be over in a few years and we don't really need to worry about it. When he does talk about the marriage and sexual activity things, he's very clear that he recognized that he is unmarried. That's very clear in this letter. And Barnabas, one of his followers, later gets mentioned as he's unmarried, but everybody else in the church leadership is married. Peter had a mention of his mother-in-law in the Gospels, so clearly had to have a wife to have a mother-in-law. All the other Jewish leaders, Jewish Christian leaders, were married. And Paul chose not to. And he says, but he recognizes that he's different. That there's nothing wrong with marriage, he says, that if you're going to burn with sexual desire, I think that's his actual term he uses, burn with desire, then go ahead and get married. It's much better to go ahead and get married where you can solve your sexual drives than to be constantly troubled by them, and therefore you may stray. He's actually very practical here in advising his congregation. He's really in a pastoral mode rather than a theologian mode in this part of the letter. So he recognizes that sexual desire is there. It's part of human nature, and you have to deal with it. He also puts more equality in marriage than people tend to give him credit for. Because people will, and this is the point I've said at the very beginning of Paul's letters, you cannot accurately pull certain amounts of verses out, half a verse, 2 verses, 3 verses, and truly represent what he's saying, because he says a lot of things in more complex situation. And this about the status of equality in marriage is much different than many people interpret it. He says that the woman's body does belong to the husband. And then he says in the next verse, the husband's body belongs to the wife. So if that's an equality, if that isn't an equality statement, I don't know what it is. But you can pull out the first thing and say, see, he said men are superior. He doesn't say that at all. What he's really trying to tell people in these marriages, which are often arranged marriages, not necessarily love matches. And I've known people even in modern era who have arranged marriages. They come from Middle Eastern or South Asian countries where you have arranged marriages. That basically he's telling the wives, you can't expect your husband to be faithful if you deny him sexual activity. And the same thing to the husbands. You can't expect your wife to be faithful if you deny her sexual activity. So she has claim on your body, you have claim on his body. It's extremely practical. People don't read the practicality in it, but it's there. And he goes on personally, that this is not for him, that he's made his choice, because he recognizes that if you're a married Christian, you have responsibilities not just to the faith, but to your spouse. That you've got these other distractions that you have to take care of, and so he makes that point very clearly. And he says these are just pastoral guidance things. Wives should not leave their husbands. Basically, don't abandon them. Husbands should not divorce their wives. It's right there. He says these things in follow-up. And then he talks his own policies about some, and he says, these are my policies, not God's. What do you do in a mixed marriage? If a believer is married to a non-believer, do they have to separate? And he says, no. If they're content with that situation, they can stay together. If they want to separate on that basis, that's okay. We have mixed marriages now. Mixed marriages. I had a couple that were exactly the opposite politically, one of my patients, and they laughed how they canceled each other's vote out all the time. But they got along fine, and that's okay. So you can handle these mixed marriage situations if you're comfortable with yourself and the situation. He also said, this is a point, he said, be content with yourself. If you're not married and you don't want to get married, that's okay. Be content with that. If you're not married and you want to get married, go ahead. Be content with that. And he even gets into the circumcision thing. If you're not circumcised, you don't have to be circumcised. Now remember, circumcision then was very different than it is now. It was practiced as a rite of ethnic passage as an infant. Now it's primarily for hygiene, and it's really not an issue much here. But he says, if you are one or the other, be content with yourself. And he has one that's kind of tricky. He said, if you're a slave, accept that is your role. And, in the American anti-slavery movement, which came out of churches like the Methodists, the opponents of abolition would pull various things out of context like this and say, aha, see? And that's part of the problem of not understanding what Paul's saying. What Paul's saying is, hey, the world's going to end in a few years anyway. And if you're a Christian slave, he doesn't say, and implies, if you're a Christian slave owner, treat your Christian slaves well, because the world's going to end anyway. And the other thing to really understand here is there was no interest in an anti-slavery movement in the Roman Empire at this time. I mean, none, zippo. And it wasn't an issue that had even occurred to people until late 18th century, early 19th century Britain and America, when it just started around 1800. A little bit before that, John Newton and a few people Wilberforce got it going. So, and the slavery he's dealing with in Corinth is very different than the extremely abusive agricultural slavery of the New World here. The cotton fields in America, the sugarcane fields in the Caribbean islands, people drop dead all the time from that. So it was different. But the real issue here is Paul was not a civil reformer. He was not trying to reform the Roman Empire. He knew better than that. He was a theological preacher who wanted to bring people to salvation through Jesus Christ. So he was not going to mess with the Roman authorities. He knew better. Tiny little churches, probably 1 or 2% of the empire at this time. The Romans could have squashed them if they wanted to. The Romans basically left them alone. They just thought these are these Jewish people fighting over this, whether this guy's alive or dead, and just leave him alone. Let them fight it out. So it's a great advantage. Within a couple hundred years, the church took over the empire. But Paul had enough sense not to tangle with the Roman authorities. This was part of the culture. It never occurred to anybody to change it. And so the fact that people tried to use this 150, 200 years ago to defend slavery, it's got nothing to do with what Paul really meant at the time. This is why we go through these lessons, to explain the context in which these things were said. Then he goes on to avoid conflict with the civil authorities. We talked about that before. And remember that this was much different than the slavery we know here. Then he deals with an issue which was important to them but not to us. Do you eat meat that was sacrificed to the pagan gods? If you remember when we were back in Acts, that was part of the policy that the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem wanted to impose on the Greek Christians, that they would not eat the food sacrificed to idols. The problem is there wasn't any other food available, any other meat available. And Paul says, listen, we know these gods don't exist. It's nothing. They're nothing. It's nothing. There's only one God. You don't have to worry about that, okay? But we have to be concerned with appearances, he says. So if you're a comfortable Christian and you know these gods are false and you go into the temple with your friends in one of these pagan temples and eat a big meal there, and someone who's also in the community sees you, they're going to think, what's going on here? And this is part of Paul's pastoral responsibility. As a Christian, you have a responsibility to other people in the church to support them and not to put them in difficult situations. So don't go in the temples, even if you have pagan friends. He doesn't say it that way, but that's what he implies. And eat this meat that was sacrificed to the gods. Be discreet. If you buy this in the butcher shop, okay, don't worry about it, because it probably came from a sacrificial thing, but it doesn't matter. These gods aren't existent anyway. And he follows to the point of be very careful to those who are new to the faith. They're vulnerable. They don't have the depth of understanding. They can't blow these things off the way you can. And so you have to be careful with them. Then he deals with another issue. He talks about his own history in the church, that he has been an unusual thing now, a self-supporting missionary. He was a tent maker, and he supported himself, and he did not ask them for support for himself. And that's an interesting thing. You see some recent pastors now living like princes, and I personally am horrified by that, because the purpose of being a church and a minister is not to make money and live comfortably. It's to espouse a faith. But he talks about that he and Barnabas have supported themselves. He does raise money from them, not for him, but to take back to Jerusalem to support the congregation there. And then he talks about how important it is that you support the other members of the congregation, because it's easy for them to backslide into the heathen behavior around them, the false gods, the sexual misconduct, other things like that. Then he goes into a very interesting thing, which still is an issue in modern Christianity, which is decorum in worship. Should a woman wear a veil and or cover her head? Okay? And people need to read the whole section, because it says that, that a woman, if she cuts off all her hair, that dishonors her. If a man let his hair grow too long, that dishonors him. I didn't read this back in the 60s in my pseudo-hippie days. Pseudo-hippie, it's very clear here. And now that the barbershops have been closed for a couple of months, I'm getting that way now, so just ignore it. But he goes on about this, and he talks about, because he's basically trying to say, you don't want to upset the worship service by your personal appearance. But everybody ignores what he says later. He says, well, decide for yourselves. My response to that is, okay, we can decide for ourselves. The Roman Catholics still do this, that men do not cover their hair, and women do. The Muslim women have to wear headscarves also. The Protestant churches don't do that. If you want to cover your head when you go to church, fine. If you want to not cover it, fine. Nobody cares. It's kind of curious, because the marks honor and prestige inside the Roman clergy are in hats of some kind. Even though it's an equivalent in there. Finally, he goes on to the Lord's Supper. Now, the Lord's Supper in this era of Greece was not what we have now. We have the communion where you have the specific elements. You have the element of the bread. Sometimes it's a wafer. Sometimes it's actual chunks of bread. And then you have the drink, which is either certain churches it's wine, and the Methodist Church it's not. It's grape juice. And there's a problem in the Lord's Supper, because the Lord's Supper in those days was actual meal. They would have a meal together. That's part of the worship service. And there was a problem in the church because you had a lot of wealthy people in the Corinth church, and they would come and bring a spread, have a big meal, eat themselves to satiety. Sometimes they would get drunk with too much wine, and the poorer people would be sitting there watching these people stuff themselves under the guise of the church. And Paul's saying, don't do that. That's not the point. The point of this is to celebrate the Lord's sacrifice, not to stuff ourselves. So if you're going to have to stuff yourself, eat a meal before you come. Then you can bring a more benign, modest meal and share it with everybody else. So it's a very important point. And he talks about the history of the Lord's Supper. And he does not mention the question about transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is the Roman Catholic belief that at the time of the ceremony, when the priest raises the elements up, they actually become the body and the blood of Jesus. But it's not an ancient belief. It really appears in about the 12th century in Europe. So it's not an ancient belief. It's one of those things that if you want to believe it, with me it's fine. That's not the point. You don't squabble over things. But it's not way back in Paul's, and there's no mention of it in the New Testament, that this actually becomes the body and the blood, which I think would have been a bit horrifying to the Semitic Christians about drinking human blood and stuff. So it's not in there. What he's really talking about is to truly make this not a personal feast for your own gratification, but a celebration of the Lord's sacrifice in there. So this was the agape feast, which he's trying to direct toward more like our much more modest communion at this point. So I'm going to stop here, and we've gotten 2/3 of the way through this in 1 Corinthians. We'll finish it up next week. But if you're looking back at what we talked about, there's a lot in here. There's a lot of things that people don't interpret properly in my read of it. So you got to read the whole thing. You can't just pluck little things out of Paul's letters like you can, the Beatitudes stand alone, the prodigal son stands alone, a variety of Jesus' parables stand alone. This doesn't. You got to read this whole thing. Remember what he said about covering your head? Decide yourself. Okay, that means you decide yourself. What he says about the celibacy question. It'd be better if you did because the world's going to end. But if you're going to burn, go ahead and with passion, then go ahead and get married. So, you can over and misinterpret these things. And while the husband controls the wife's body, the wife controls the husband. There's actually much more equality between the genders in Paul's letters than people think. So this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We'll stop here and we'll wrap up in another week on the last part of 1 Corinthians, which has spiritual gifts. Very interesting section. And it has the love sonnet that everybody remembers from 1 Corinthians 13 for the weddings. And we'll talk about that. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you very much.